Hello, my name is Kay. Welcome to Art Book Nook, where I review my vast collection of art and craft books. Painting with Watercolour by David Howell. This isn't a step-by-step instructional guide, it's more of a window into how David Howell thinks and paints. The focus is on how he approaches a scene, his use of colour, edges and atmosphere. If you're a beginner looking for guided exercises, this might not be the best starting point. But if you love landscapes, you'll find plenty of inspiration in David's beautiful paintings. I've linked to a few excellent beginner-friendly books below. For those of you who are already painting watercolour and want to deepen your understanding of what makes a painting truly shine, painting with watercolour offers a rare insight into the mind of a professional artist. David Howell is known for his loose, atmospheric landscapes and seascapes. Let's take a look inside together. The book contains 10 chapters: materials and equipment, working with watercolour, the importance of drawing and sketching, composition and construction, understanding colour, landscapes, marine, townscapes, putting life into paintings, and framing and finishing. In the introduction, David shares that he began painting when he was just 5 or 6 years old, using a small metal tin of 12 watercolour pans with little mixing wells in the lid. As his skills developed, he explored oils and acrylics, and for a time watercolour took on a supporting role, mainly for adding colour to plein air sketches that would later become larger studio pieces. But it was his wife who pointed out that she preferred his watercolours, and as it turned out, so did his customers. David explains this book draws on his 70 years of painting experience with what is often considered a challenging medium. So rather than offering step-by-step instruction, he shares his ideas and insights that can help to make your own painting methods more exciting and painterly. In Chapter 1, David gives us an insight into the materials and equipment he likes to use. I won't go into all of that in detail, but I do want to share his colour palette, because that's what first drew me to his work, along with his loose and beautifully fresh painting style. David's main palette includes a warm and cool version of each of the primary colours: cobalt blue, ultramarine, alizarin crimson, cadmium red, cadmium yellow and cadmium lemon. Cadmium lemon. He explains why he's chosen these particular colours and explores colour mixing with these in more detail later in Chapter 5. David also includes 6 earth colours: yellow ochre, raw sienna, raw umber, burnt sienna, burnt umber and light red. And there are a couple of additional cooler blues too: cerulean blue, which he uses for winter skies, and Prussian blue, which he finds useful for mixing dark greens. This is a watercolour sketch of Whitby Harbour in Yorkshire, painted on 300-gram Waterford knot surface paper. David then continues with brushes and watercolour paper. He shares several examples of his work painted on different types and weights of paper from a range of manufacturers. For each painting, he explains why he chose that particular surface, how its texture, absorbency or weight suited the subject and the effect he wanted to achieve. David concludes Chapter 1 with an overview of the equipment he takes with him on location. In Chapter 2, David talks about his approach to working with watercolour and how easy it is to become obsessed with detail. He reminds us that some of the most admired French Impressionists, although they had access to photography, would have been working from images that were black and white and of very poor quality, uncluttered and free from distracting detail. The point he makes is that painters need to spend more time really seeing and understanding what they're looking at, rather than trying to record everything they see. When you look up at a tree, for example, you don't see every single leaf. You see light, shadow, movement and shape, and that's what David is encouraging us to capture. David makes 4 key points here that he'd like you to consider. 1. Take yourself outside and sketch. He says just sitting on a stool, sketching on location for a short time could change your life. Being outdoors really helps you see and connect with your subject. 2. Paint without drawing. David compares it to a paraglider jumping off a high mountain. Painting directly without a preliminary drawing gives you a wonderful sense of freedom. And as David puts it, carefully painting over a precise drawing can start to feel a bit like colouring in a book. 3. Use big brushes so you're not tempted to fiddle with detail. And 4. Study other painters, both past and present. When you find an artist you really admire, ask yourself why. What is it about their work that appeals to you? Is it the colours, the atmosphere, the looseness? David says one of the worst things you can do is to sit and stare at a blank white sheet of paper. Instead, he encourages you to just get started, make a mark or lay in a wash. He illustrates this by taking us through his process for painting pin mill, shown at the bottom right of the page, explaining how he begins, builds his washes and gradually develops the painting. David's painting of the Al-Basha Mosque in Jeddah is a good example of the use of the wet in wet technique. These buildings in the old city of Jeddah are largely constructed with coral stone of various shades, and the intense sunlight reflects off both them and the surrounding flat surfaces. If this was painted in flat washes of ochres and umbers, it wouldn't look nearly so interesting, but by using wet in wet, the walls and buildings have a constantly varied colouring like they do in real life. In addition to colour introduced to existing washes, further colour has been added when the appropriate area is dried to create more variation. Snow on King's Sedgemoor is quite a simple painting, but shows how much can be achieved with minimum content. Colours used are cobalt blue and Prussian blue in the sky to get the depth of colour, ultramarine and burnt sienna to get the black of the winter bushes, and raw sienna for the winter grass and vegetation. There's a bit of burnt sienna in the left-hand vegetation as well, and the cold shadows in the snow would have again used burnt sienna and possibly a smidgen of alizarin crimson here and there. The treatment of everything from the distant church to the foreground grasses and bulrushes is loose and impressionistic. Fence posts are at various heights and angles, and about the only area that shows a little more accuracy are the branches in the willow trees. It was too cold for David to paint this on the spot, and the picture was completed from memory and a very quick sketch. Chapter 3 is where David really emphasises the importance of drawing and sketching, which he describes as an invaluable skill for recording whatever captures your interest. On the left-hand page, we're treated to a gorgeous full-page reproduction of his painting called Montrachet, and I just love the colours. In this chapter, David shares a lovely selection of sketches in different media. We begin with this delicate study, Stays from the Cow Bar, drawn with a mix of graphite and coloured pencil. Top right, we're shown a sketch of Penny Ghent rendered with a clutch pencil, using a 5.6mm lead to build tone and texture. And below that, we've got Cottages at Clapham, which offers another example of a tonal study, this time drawn with the same clutch pencil alongside a more conventional 8B pencil, creating beautiful depth and contrast. Speed was essential for David when sketching the working horses, top right. They were constantly on the move, and in this kind of situation, he says you might prefer to rely on a camera for backup later. Bottom right, Barnes at Westonzoyland, is a quick pencil and crayon sketch. The tonal value of the sky was important and contrasted with the lighter and brighter colours of the winter grasses in front of the barn. A camera might well not have been able to get this right and may have reduced the silhouette of the distant church to almost nothing. I'm so pleased David is sharing all these sketches with us. This particular sketch is so simple. I find it really inspirational. I think sometimes we put far too much pressure on ourselves, even when sketching, to create some sort of masterpiece. Oh wow, just look at these. Honestly, I'd be quite happy to frame every one of them and hang them on my wall. David explains that working on a small scale can be surprisingly effective. Once you accept that sketching isn't about accuracy, but more about the fluidity of line and shape, using watercolour and brushes simply takes the idea a step further. blurring the lines between a quick sketch and a finished painting. These are so gorgeous, I've got to enlarge them so I can share them with you properly. This is another pencil and crayon sketch, this time in Friesland in Holland. The sky in this sketch conveys the flat pale greeny grey of a cold winter. It's very subtle, but it sets the tone for the final painting. I can't pronounce the title of this next one, but it's somewhere in Brittany, so I won't embarrass myself by trying. But part of the attraction of this picture for David was the colour of the boat moored at the quayside, but it's also a good example of a complicated subject developed in colour. This took an hour or so for David to finish. Stormy Skies along the River Humber is a good example of what can be achieved relatively quickly without too much finesse or detail. It's primarily a sky picture on a windy, stormy day, painted with freedom and a certain amount of bravado. It's painted on an A4 size loose sheet of Cardi 300 gram, rough, held down with clips on a drawing board fitted on a camera tripod. David says it may only be a sketch, but it has the vitality and sparkle that many carefully considered works might lack. I think it's just lovely. And here is another example of a watercolour sketch, a moorland landscape. David says there wasn't enough time to paint a proper watercolour, but the sketch captures the feeling of distance towards the Lake District mountains that he wanted. And lastly, we have two more complex drawings of Venice that have everything needed for David to work on them back in the studio. Chapter 4, Composition and Construction, How to Make Paintings Work, is all about building a painting with pulling power, something that captures the eye from across the room and invites viewers to look closer and understand what it's about. For artists, it starts with a simple but very important question. Why do I want to paint this? Once you can answer that, composition becomes a tool to express that intention. And once again, your sketchbook becomes your greatest asset. It's the perfect place to experiment with the arrangement of shapes, explore colour relationships, and play with contrast before committing anything to a final painting. David's painting, called Clearing Fog at Langport, is the sort of painting that works. The eye flows through it from the reeds on the left-hand side, across the water towards the town and the church, in particular up on the hill, and the willows on the right stop the eye drifting out of the picture. The way these elements are placed are not accidental, and may not be where they actually were at the time. David enters a detailed discussion of the golden mean, which put simply is a way of dividing a scene into thirds to create a balanced and harmonious composition. He shares 3 of his sketches where he experiments with different arrangements before committing to a final painting, explaining how subtle changes in placement can make a big difference to the overall feel and structure of the final work. David now gives us an explanation of how not to arrange a composition. In this painting, the church campanile is placed exactly where it should be, 1/3 from the top edge and 1/3 in from the left, following the golden section. It ought to be the main focal point, but instead a large tree dominates the foreground, and our attention is drawn away toward a small group of people standing just to the left and slightly behind the tree. Our eyes are naturally drawn to people and faces first, so their placement can easily override the intended centre of interest. The watercolour itself isn't a bad painting, but David believes it could be improved even further. He painted this version from slightly further back in the square, but he still feels there's a lack of focus on the main point of interest, the far end of the square with the campanile and the surrounding buildings. These elements are all interesting shapes and are positioned correctly compositionally, but once again our attention is pulled between the groups of people and the tree. One of the great charms of Venice is the absence of vehicles, which means people walk or travel by boat, and as a result there are always people about everywhere. If you leave them out, it stops being a true painting of Venice. This challenge, as David points out, is finding a way to include them without allowing them to overpower the focal point. This is a revised tonal graphite sketch of the square. The building still features the main attraction, silhouetted against the strong sky and located as a group around the campanile at roughly 1/3 from the right-hand edge of the page. The bright paving of the square swings round towards them, and by moving the left-hand group of figures back a bit, they don't get in the way, and it allows the viewer's eye to find its way into the picture on the left-hand side via the pigeons and the group of figures, and then down the square to the buildings and church at the far end. The right-hand pair of the figures in the watercolour have been removed and replaced by a more distant and less distinct figure, which repeats the 1/3 principle by being placed off-centre in the gap between the tree, figures, flagpole on the left and the buildings on the right, whereas in the watercolour they were bang in the middle of the gap. This is a loose, rapid sketch, but as a composition it has a better balance and works more effectively than the watercolour painting. What do you think? Let me know in the comments below. Taking time to think about compositional issues right from the very beginning will always pay dividends in your paintings. David suggests using adjustable viewing frames, which you can hold out in front of your subject and adjust these between landscape, portrait or square formats to discover what will work best. It is also essential to consider perspective if you want to create the illusion of depth. Najac is a medieval village in the Dordogne region of France, where the main street drops steeply downhill towards a magnificent castle perched on a rocky outcrop. It's a lovely paintable subject, but it demands close attention to the angles of roof lines, windows and doors. If the angles aren't correct, the whole painting will look slightly off. It's equally important to observe the size of figures, as they become smaller the further away they are from you. David's advice is to check, check and check again. I've added a link in the description below to another of my book reviews. It's an excellent book by Ian Roberts that focuses entirely on composition and perspective. Here we have 3 further examples of perspective. In the painting on the left, Castelvecchio, Umbria, the perspective lines of the buildings reflect the high viewpoint, and the receding spurs of the landscape become paler and progressively cooler in colour as they move further into the distance. Top right, we see the same village painted from a different angle, this time further down the hill, where all the buildings now sit above eye level, a completely different perspective on the same subject. Bottom right is Brixham. The square format here brings something a little different compared with the traditional landscape format, but the same principles still apply. The red and orange boats in the foreground are warm and immediately command attention, but then your eye naturally travels up the street towards the gable ends of the cottages, where the bright light colours help to balance the entire composition. Chapter 5, Understanding Colour. This goes into great detail about the pigments David uses and the reasons behind his choices. This chapter could be a book in itself, so I'll just share an overview of the key points. David first introduced his palette back in chapter 1, but as a reminder, here it is again. A primary colour is one that cannot be mixed from any other colour, but that being said, primary pigments still have a bias, leaning towards one or other of the primaries. For example, alizarin crimson leads towards blue, making it a cool red, whilst cadmium red leans towards yellow, making it a warm red. That's why it's important to really get to know your colours, so you can choose the right red or any other primary when mixing. David also reminds us of an important fact. All watercolour paints will fade eventually if they're exposed to bright sunlight. Some pigments are more fugitive, meaning they will fade faster than others. You can slow this process down by avoiding direct sunlight on your finished paintings and by framing them behind UV protective glass, although that can be a bit expensive. David explains that shadows are not black, they have colour. The 2 paintings of the boat on the left illustrate this. In the top left painting, the shadow side of the boat has been created by darkening the existing colours with their complementary colour hues. This approach desaturates the colours without deadening them. In the bottom left version, David has used Payne's grey. As a result, the colours on the shadow side of the pot appear dull, and the cast shadow itself is harder and far less interesting. The deadening effect of Payne's grey has effectively killed the colour, a clear example of why understanding how to mix shadow tones really matters. This watercolour shows a street in the ancient city of Jeddah in Saudi Arabia. The light is intensely bright, and you might expect the shadows to be excessively dark in comparison. The reality, however, is that the shaded areas are full of colour and reflected light rather than just dark grey, and using the complementary principle ensures that these areas retain their vibrancy and colour. Here are 3 examples of capturing different light effects. David is particularly fond of the cadmiums because they're such vibrant, saturated pigments. In the painting top left, he's captured the brilliance of a sunrise using cadmium yellow. Just below, he shows how this compares with the use of earth colours, which produce a more muted and subdued effect. On the right, the painting of Pin Mill illustrates a very different mood, a cooler, colder light. Here David has relied largely on ultramarine blue to convey that crisp atmospheric quality. The world isn't always bright and shining, and atmospheric paintings in wet and foggy conditions can be just as compelling. The important point here is that both of these paintings have used the same pigments. The painting on the left is Sea Fret and Rain in Staithes, North Yorkshire, England, and the one on the right is Red Sea Sunset in Jeddah. David shares a personal story. He says, when painting the picture of Staithes, it was a day when it made more sense to just give up and go home. When watercolour is being washed off the paper as fast as you can get it on, you have a problem. But sometimes paintings produced in adverse conditions can be equally effective as chocolate box sunshine. If you've never been to Staithes, it really is a wonderful destination to explore. It has winding cobbled streets and charming 18th century cottages, and the coastal village is full of character. Since the 1800s, it's been a magnet for artists. It was once a bustling fishing port, but today it's more of a tourist destination. And I've been very fortunate. I attended an oil painting course with David Howell in Staithes several years ago. If you ever get the chance to visit, I highly recommend the Cod and Lobster pub, where you can get the most delicious fresh crab sandwiches. Chapter 6 is all about landscapes. This is what I love to paint. Just look at David's wonderful painting on the left, Langport in the snow. David says that dog owners have a particular advantage because walking the dog gets them out and about in their local surroundings, often exploring places they might never have ventured otherwise. And he's absolutely right. They certainly do get you out and about. I wasn't going to have another dog after I lost Mr. Bracken, but I realised one day that I hadn't physically left my house for 3 solid weeks. Now, when I take Tinker for a walk, a 20-minute stroll will often turn into nearly 2 hours, because people who live in my village just love to stop and chat. David says it's so easy to walk straight past everyday painting opportunities unless you cultivate the essential skill of keeping your eyes open. Devon Bank is a perfect example of focusing on a small, ordinary area rather than a vast panoramic view. In his painting, the tree trunks and the fence become the main points of interest, while the background hills are simply blocked in with cool blues and greys. When it comes to colour, David warns against relying too heavily on photographs, explaining that nothing beats being present and recording the colours exactly as you see them. We often associate snow with turning everything white, but in reality there's a surprising amount of colour. If you shine a coloured light on a white piece of paper, what do you see? Perspective is another area where cameras can cause problems, especially cameras in phones and mobile devices, which have a fixed lens. They often make distant objects appear even farther away than they really are, distorting the sense of depth. An experienced artist can often tell whether a scene was painted en plein air or copied directly from a photograph. And that's another danger. Relying too much on photos can lead to a painting that's essentially just a copy of the scene, without any creativity or individual interpretation, resulting in something that's static and unimaginative. Once again, David refers us back to Chapter 3 on sketching, reminding us that regular use of a sketchbook will make a huge difference to your work. Here David compares his process of creating a painting entirely from a sketch without any photographic reference to one where he worked from photograph. It's a revealing comparison that highlights the difference between interpreting a subject through observation and drawing and simply reproducing what the camera tried to capture. The sketch for Dead and Vale, shown on the left, was produced in just 15 minutes. David even borrowed a few cows from an adjacent field to add life and movement to the composition. Bottom left is the watercolour David created later that same day, working entirely from the sketch and without any photographic reference at all. It's an excellent example of how a quick observational sketch can provide all the information you need to complete a finished painting. I just love the limited palette in this painting. It captures the mood of a grey day here in the UK perfectly, and I really admire how David has represented the scene with so few brushstrokes. There's a simplicity and confidence to it that I'm in awe of. The photograph on the right-hand page is a good example of what happens when you take a picture with a phone camera. There is a church in the distance if you look really carefully, but it's represented so small that it has virtually vanished. It's not a very exciting image either, and if you were to copy it directly into a painting, David says the result would be rather boring. So instead, he begins by creating a compositional sketch based on the photograph, one that's far more interesting and much closer to the view that originally attracted David to the scene. With the photo now set aside, David starts his painting on a quarter sheet of Waterford 650 gram rough paper, which is quite a generous size. Using a number 6 squirrel mop brush, he makes a few loose marks to establish the basic structure. He stresses that there's no need to be super accurate, and there's no pencil drawing on the paper either. David is well known for not starting his paintings with a pencil drawing, which helps to keep his paintings loose. Moving on, bottom right, we see David adding the sky and distant hills. Top left, the sky has been developed further and the trees have been painted in and around the church. David says the biggest danger at this stage is doing too much and losing that fresh, spontaneous feel. Bottom left, we see the finished painting. David isn't entirely sure about the addition of the reeds in the foreground. He feels they may have introduced an unnecessary degree of fussiness. What do you think? Do the reeds add to the composition or do they distract from it? Let me know in the comments below. I'd love to hear your thoughts. Here are several more examples of David's beautiful paintings, each accompanied by his insights into his thinking behind them. He reminds us that it isn't the artist's job to record everything exactly as it is. What truly matters is in the end you create a successful painting. Dead and Vale is the landscape where the great John Constable lived and worked. It's an area of gentle beauty, trees, fields and expansive skies. And working in the same location makes you realise just how much Constable himself moved things around to strengthen his compositions. Artistic interpretation, rather than strict accuracy, is at the heart of being a true artist. Chapter 7 focuses on marinescapes, and David begins by offering advice for painting these subjects on plein air, where you're far more likely to encounter wet and windy conditions. Working outdoors by the water can be unpredictable, but it also brings a freshness to your work that's virtually impossible to capture from a photograph or in the studio. One of the main challenges with marine painting is that of painting boats, and that they curve in all sorts of directions and all kinds of funny angles. And of course not all boats are alike. A fishing boat working out of a Cornish harbour is very different from a chroma crab boat. David likens marine painting to life drawing, where close observation is essential. The key, he says, is not to make assumptions, but to paint or draw exactly what you see, and to keep checking angles and proportions continuously as you work. Being out on the water in a boat also gives you a completely different perspective, but because of the constant movement, you have to work quickly and respond to what's in front of you. Once again, your sketchbook is your best friend. It allows you to capture the essentials rapidly and build on them later back in the studio. One location that's a real magnet for artists is Venice in Italy. David has painted there many times in the footsteps of the likes of Turner and Caravaggio, and over the years has built up a library of sketches that he returns to again and again. It's a subject David never tires of. As long as you don't block narrow paths or alleyways with your gear, nobody minds you working on site, but you need to be prepared to be filmed by tourists and even asked for the occasional selfie. Chapter 8 is all about townscapes. When it comes to painting these subjects, David reminds us that our job is to create an attractive painting, one that captures the spirit and atmosphere of a place, not to produce an architectural illustration. What we really need to do is learn to identify interesting shapes and colours, and to simplify what we see. A proper understanding of perspective is essential though. I mentioned earlier an excellent and very readable book on perspective, Mastering Composition by Ian Roberts. I've linked my review of it in the description below if you'd like to explore that further. Beginning with his initial sketch, David talks us through how he painted this French scene, a townscape that also includes a quay and water. While simplification is key, he reminds us not to overlook the small details that give a place its character. Drain pipes, guttering, telephone wires and cables and aerials all add authenticity. But that being said, it's perfectly fine to leave out an ugly waste bin. David also warns against one of the worst habits you can adopt in a scene like this, which is starting at one edge and working your way slowly down and across the paper. Instead, he suggests you think of your paintbrush as a dancer, moving lightly around the entire surface to bring the painting together as a whole. Here David describes how he approached his painting of a piazza in San Benedetto. And we also have some lovely examples of David's work from various locations around the world, including France, Venice, Italy, Saudi Arabia and England. Notice how effectively he's conveyed the different qualities of light in each place through his choice of colours. It's a wonderful demonstration of how to capture light and atmosphere. Chapter 9 is all about putting life into your paintings. David notes that a surprising number of artists shy away from including people in their work, yet it's rare to encounter a real scene without them. He encourages you to think of people simply as shapes. In this beautiful painting of a quay in France, a lovely combination of both the marine and a townscape, the scene would feel strangely empty without the figures on the quayside. They add a real sense of life and movement. When I look at this painting, I can almost hear the sounds of people talking, birds calling, and boats bobbing about in the water. David suggests building up your confidence by sketching people and animals often, creating a library of reference material in your sketchbook. Over time, this will become an invaluable resource you can draw on again and again when adding life to your paintings. In David's sketch of a souk in Tunis, notice how the people all merge into a single mass. You only recognise that there's a group of figures because their heads have been accentuated. Likewise, if you look at the page on the right, you'll notice that the people in these paintings are simply coloured shapes that often merge together. David's made no attempt to paint individual features, yet the sense of life and movement in all these images is unmistakable. I've personally found the information David shares in just these few pages really helpful. It's given me the confidence to start including people in my own paintings from now on. The next 4 pages in David's book focus on life drawing. I've excluded these from this video in order to stay compliant with YouTube's guidelines to ensure that I can share this review with as many people as possible. Which brings us to the final chapter, framing and finishing your work. Here David provides valuable advice on how to display and protect your paintings so they look their best and stand the test of time. He also includes a helpful section on exhibiting and working with galleries, as well as practical tips on how to photograph your work effectively. An essential skill if you plan to share your paintings online or submit them for exhibitions. And that brings us to the end of Painting with Watercolour by David Howell. I hope you've enjoyed exploring his book with me. It isn't a step-by-step instructional guide, but rather an inspiring insight into how professional landscape artists think, sees and paints, which I think is invaluable. I've certainly learned a lot from David's observations, from the importance of sketching and simplifying shapes to the subtleties of colour, composition and atmosphere. It's a book that I return to again and again for ideas and inspiration. I find David's work beautiful. I'd love to know your thoughts about the book. Have you read it, or has anything here inspired you to try a new approach in your own painting? Please let me know in the comments below. I always love to hear from you. In the description below, I've included links to David Howell's website, where you can find more information about David's work and gallery representation. I've also linked to another video on YouTube, which is actually a trailer for a video workshop, a watercolour video workshop with him. This is available to purchase through APV Films. You'll also find links to where you can buy your own copy of David's wonderful book to add to your library. It's a real treasure, honestly. If you use those links, you'll be supporting my channel at no extra cost yourself, and I'd really appreciate it. And if you found my review helpful, please consider giving it a thumbs up and subscribing to Art Book Nook. I'll share many more reviews of beautiful art and craft books and creative inspiration. So thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate your time. Happy painting.